anyway, I I'm just going to show this slide. We saw that Bentham was probably overly optimistic in thinking that when we compared pains and pleasures, we could actually assign exact numbers to them. You know, in other words, in this example, we've got numbers assigned, but you know, you might say, well, how on earth do you get those numbers? You know, you can't see inside people's minds. You can't guess how they're going to enjoy or not enjoy the circus. Plus, as I think I said last time, if you ever look at the Bureau of Standards definitions for units of measure that we take for granted and use every day, you would be amazed at how complex they are. You know, and that's because they want it to be exactly defined. What counts as a meter in length or a degree Celsius or Fahrenheit. But it doesn't seem like you can do that at all with something like a hedon. And that poses a major problem, because if you don't know, okay, so, oh man, this is not the one I wanted to start with because I have all these little things. The point is, it's not just that pains and pleasures are subjective, and they are. Plus, if you're doing utilitarian reasoning, you've got to project what you think the pains and pleasures will be in the future, not just what's happening now. So you have to guess, if you're the uncle here, how much, you know, the kid's going to enjoy the circus. You know, I once went with a divorcee who had two small kids to a fair, and I thought they'd enjoy the side event of a demolition derby, you know, being a kid from Baltimore City. Yeah. But they didn't, you know. And so sometimes it's hard to predict what future consequences are going to be, you know. So you have the subjectiveness of pains and pleasures, plus you'll notice I say here that it makes the standardization of a countable unit problematic. In other words, for other units of measure, people can objectively confirm, you know, the standard, but it's hard to say what's supposed to count as a unit's worth of pleasure or pain. And the point here is, how do you know if you have 2 or 10 or 20 of something if you don't know what's to count as having one of that thing? And the problem with Bentham's hedons is it's practically impossible to say what's to count as a hedon's worth of pleasure. Now, utilitarians will reply that we do compare pains and pleasures. Right? When I'm talking about this accident, I can talk about my pain today versus what it was last Thursday. And if somebody says my headache today is worse than the one I had yesterday, as I have it in the slide, they're not speaking gobbledygook. We understand them. But here again, even if you're talking about this chart that hospitals often have on the wall where they ask patients to estimate your pain level today on a scale of 1 to 10. Medical people know that all they're getting is a subjective report of how the patient rates their own pain. They're not getting something that's scientifically, intersubjectively confirmable, intersubjectively meaning confirmable between a number of people, So even though we can make rough and ready comparisons, it doesn't entail that we can make the kind of exact comparisons Bentham thought was possible. I don't think I started talking about Mill. So one of the things that we saw, let me go back one, with Bentham is he originally thought that we can be very simple if we're utilitarians, and the only thing we need to worry about if we're comparing pains and pleasures for the purpose of utilitarian moral reasoning, to balance them out, the only thing we really need to worry about is the quantity of them that we have. And, we saw he had the hedon as a unit of quantity, as a measurable unit. And in an earlier slide, I have part of a famous quote by Bentham where he says, quantity of pleasure being the same, pushpins as good as poetry. Well, to start again, in other words, Bentham said that even a simple child's game, like pushpin, which I've heard is something like pickup sticks, right? I don't even know if people play them anymore. It's funny. I mean, in elementary school, every classroom had pickup sticks as one of the games you could play with, on your lunch hour or something. But basically, they were like sharp toothpicks, only, 4 or 5 times the length of a toothpick. And I can't imagine that they'd allow that nowadays. But anyway, to get back to this, Bentham was saying, all pleasures and pains are on a par if their quantity is the same. Doesn't matter what they are. And this open utilitarianism, as Bentham first thought about it, open to the criticism that here's a moral theory that gives us a very low view of human beings. One, it views them as mere creatures of pain and pleasure. Plus, it was now the fact that I have a pig here. When I did these way back when, you weren't always hooked up to the internet back then. I think I had dial-up internet maybe. They gave you a gallery of clip art, and I couldn't find a real pig picture, so I have a piggy bank. But at any rate, the point is, I'm not making this up. They really charge utilitarianism, its detractors, as being a pig morality. In other words, by putting all pleasures on the par, Bentham seemed to be saying that if the pig out there in the field gets as much pleasure out of its daily allotment of slop as I get from reading poetry, or as you and I would get from going to a play or reading a novel, then it's all on a par. You know, and they said, well, this seems to put human beings on a par with the pigs. And so when these criticisms started rolling in, Bentham was really quite old. And, you know, we saw Bentham's last wishes there. That is very strange. That box with Bentham's body in used to be in the boardroom because he left instructions in his will that he be allowed to attend board meetings of University College London after his demise. And the guy you saw in the video, Ross Harrison, I actually sat next to him at dinner over in Aberdeen, Scotland, when I was there in 1995 for a different philosophy conference. And we got to talking about Bentham, and he said they had moved Bentham out onto a more public stair landing, and that was where you saw him. But kind of strange. Anyway, to get back to this, Bentham was quite old, and so it was really Bentham's star pupil, John Stuart Mill, who kind of picked up the mantle and tried to defend utilitarianism against its critics. And basically what Mill said is, look, this really is not a moral theory that gives us a low view of human beings, because he says there are uniquely human pleasures that the pig out there in the field knows nothing of. And so, while with Bentham, the word to remember is quantity of pleasure or pain, the word to associate with Mill is quality. He says there are qualitative distinctions between pleasures, that there are pleasures that human beings can appreciate that the pig out there in the field knows nothing of. And one of the things that Mill said was, which one of us would trade places with the pig out there in the field, even if we were promised the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures, is the way he said it in flowery 19th century English. In other words, you know, okay, I have all these complications with this accident I'm worried about now, and I know you all have other things going on in your lives, you know, stuff to worry about. So what if one of your friends said, you know what, I've been reading a book on magic on the side, I'm taking up that as a hobby, and you know what, I believe I can turn you into a pig. And what's more, I can promise you that you're not going to have all these problems you're worrying about now. You're going to be a very happy pig. What about it? How about it? Well, you know, which one of us is going to take that deal? Right? I mean, Mill says, which one of us would trade places with a pig in the field? And why wouldn't we? I'm assuming nobody would. And why? Because we know, for one thing, there are things that make our lives worthwhile and that we can appreciate as human beings that the pig out there in the field knows nothing of and never will. And this is kind of what Mill was getting at. So he says these higher pleasures are not just the pleasures of mere sensation that animals can enjoy, but he calls them the pleasures of the intellect and the imagination. And these for him are qualitatively higher. So Mill distinguishes higher from lower pleasures, and he said that uniquely higher pleasures are more desirable, even if their quantity is lower. Now here you have to think about this, because one of the things that Mill says in connection with this is that it's, and I have part of the quote here, and again, these pages in Solomon probably refer back to the 7th edition that's up there in 527, that I used probably around the year 2000 when I made this. So those pages aren't going to be right, but your syllabus has the correct pages. But Mill said, look, it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool or a pig satisfied. In other words, it's better to be Socrates with some negatives in his life, things going on, but still as somebody who can appreciate, say, the higher pleasures of discussing philosophic issues and things with his friends. Better to be Socrates with a smaller amount of a higher level pleasure than a fool or a pig with a full amount of just pleasure of sensation, like the pig eating slop. And this was a way that Mill thought he would defend this view that they had adopted of hedonism from the Greeks by making distinctions between higher and lower pleasures. But to review a slide that's earlier, hedonism is the view that it is only pleasure or happiness that's good for its own sake alone. All other goods are good only insofar as they ultimately lead to the promotion of pleasure and happiness, or at least to lessening pain and unhappiness for all concerned. So if Socrates is dissatisfied, he has I clicked on the wrong area here. If Socrates is dissatisfied, he has less pleasure. So basically, the bottom line here, and this is a subtle point, so I'm not going to pound it for very long, but this effectively abandons hedonism, because whatever makes these so-called higher pleasures higher and more desirable, it cannot be just pleasure alone. It has to be something else. Well, if you're saying that, then you're saying that there are other things that make them valuable besides pleasure alone. So what makes the higher pleasures higher can't be just pleasure alone, as I say in this slide. It seems like some other standard, or maybe multiple standards, for moral goodness are being sneaked in surreptitiously. And that's essentially what people who discuss Mill have said. So this would undermine the hedonist claim that it's only pleasure or happiness that's good for its own sake. And the word pluralism can have many meanings, but in this context, pluralism means adopting multiple standards for good. In other words, a pluralist can agree with the hedonist that pleasure or happiness, as you see in this list, is an unqualified good. But where pluralists depart from hedonists is in saying, yes, but there are other psychological states that also are to be sought for their own sake and are valuable. Knowledge as an unqualified good in itself, self-realization, the satisfaction of human preferences. Now, we're not going to get any deeper in the weeds than this slide on this, but most contemporary utilitarians are pluralists, like Jonathan Glover, who you saw in the video. One of the things he says, and I've seen this enough times that I can just about quote him word for word, he says, I find it very hard to decide whether I'm a utilitarian. He says, if by utilitarianism all you mean is pleasure in the absence of pain, that is straight hedonism, he says, no, I'm not a utilitarian. But he says if you make consequentialism sufficiently pluralistic and still call it utilitarianism, then he says, I guess I'm a utilitarian. In other words, he's willing to admit other standards for good than just pleasure. So this move overtly abandons hedonism. It says, okay, we recognize that there are other standards. So it recognizes pleasure as a standard of goodness, but it denies that pleasure or happiness. And again, the hedonists use those terms interchangeably. I mean, the utilitarians, the early utilitarians. Other things are recognized as good for their own sake, and we saw some of them there. Now, we talked about this, about a cost-benefit analysis. So, what are some of the pros and cons of utilitarianism? Well, again, one of the things they were trying to do was respond to moral skepticism from empiricists like Hume by removing morality from the realms that could not be reached by the senses. Remember, Hume says, look, you take an action like murder, you say it's got moral vice. It's a vicious act. Hume says, look at it as closely as you can, and empirically, you're never going to discern that moral quality in it. So Hume says we ought to be skeptical about moral claims to be claims that tell us something objectively about the rightness or wrongness of actions. Hume said all we're doing when we declare an action morally right or wrong is simply reflecting either our society's norms or reflecting our own psychological feelings of approval or disapproval from an action. Well, there were several reactions against Hume's skepticism, and the reaction of the utilitarians is just one of them. It's one way they tried to respond to Hume, by saying, look, if we get morality down to earth, where things are empirically discernible, then we can once more reason about moral issues. And so pains and pleasures are real feelings about real people in the real world. They're not transcendent and otherworldly. So morality then for the utilitarians And Mill and Bentham, remember, are writing in England where there is a state religion, the Church of England, Christianity, in that form. So they said, we're not trying to be anti-religious, but we think we have a way of talking about moral right and wrong that doesn't need to bring in religious assumptions. Now, whether they're right or wrong about that is arguable, but at any rate, morality then for the utilitarians isn't following the commands or dictates of an otherworldly transcendent God. It's not obeying abstract moral principles like the ones that Plato thought were built into the fabric of the universe, the forms, especially the form of good. But they said morality is a simple matter of promoting pleasure or lessening pain, promoting happiness or lessening unhappiness in society as a whole, or for everyone affected by your actions. So it's promoting pleasure or lessening pain of real people, and for animals, and for Bentham also animals in this world. Some of you may have written on this. For Bentham, he said, if you want to wonder whether we have direct moral responsibilities to non-human animals, he says, the question to ask is not, can animals reason? We saw philosophers like Aquinas and Plato and Aristotle tried to draw the line that reason for humanity, reason is uniquely human. Bentham says, no, the question asked is not, can they reason or can they talk? The ability to use language is often cited in the history of philosophy as what sets us apart as human beings. But Bentham says, no, the question to ask for animals is not, can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? Can they feel pain and pleasure? And he says if they can, then we have direct responsibilities to them. And while there are a lot of utilitarians who today are pluralists, Peter Singer, who you saw in the video, is a notable exception in that he's an old-fashioned Benthamite hedonistic utilitarian, and he's also an animal rights activist, and this comes out in one of those things I have as an extra credit assignment. And again, I'll remind you, I'll take those up to the last day of class, although don't let this out. I've been known to accept them on exams day as well, the extra credits, but don't tell anyone that. Again, doesn't hurt you. Remember, I don't grade the extra credits. If you do the minimum, you get the 10 points per thing. I already said it. Well, at any rate, I don't want to go into a lot of detail. So, a lot of philosophers also believe that when we're making moral decisions, we should be able to take what's called the moral point of view. We should be able to make our moral decisions as if we are a disinterested, the word is disinterested, not uninterested, as if we were the disinterested spectator on the scene who didn't have a dog in the fight, so to speak. In other words, ideally you're supposed to do utilitarian reasoning without putting yourself and your wants first. In the real world, often this is not the case. People reason egoistically, and they try to pretend that they're being objective. Think about that simple case we were talking about, the uncle. Suppose the uncle really wants to stay at home, right? Even if the kid would enjoy the circus considerably, the uncle can always rationalize it away, say, you know what, the kid's getting a little, I don't think he'd really enjoy the circus, and I'm going to really enjoy this buck. You know, in other words, we can always cook the books in our favor, so to speak, when we do utilitarian reasoning. And see, this is one of the big criticisms with ethical egoism. If the only moral obligation you have as an ethical egoist, and a lot of you wrote on that topic, is to promote your own interests, then you can't take the objective moral point of view, right? You can't say, I'm going to turn back, come back from the situation and just try to figure out what the right thing is, as if my interests don't even matter, because if you're an egoist, your interests are the only things that matter. So utilitarianism, because it talks about maximizing the good for all concerned, can take an objective, disinterested point of view on a situation. And you can say it's straightforward and objective. It is deceptively simple, right? It views the right course of action simply as what gets the best results, and recognizes, as Peter Singer says, that morality should make an actual difference in the world. So we just weigh the possible consequences of our actions and crunch the numbers, and we've got the morally right thing to do worked out for us. And you can say it's realistic. Now, recognizes that real morality must often balance the interests of the many against the interests of the few. Now, this, for some people, is also a criticism of utilitarianism. Because think about it, if we're talking about eminent domain, and I can't imagine how they built that building, leveled a whole square block of homes without exercising eminent domain to force those people to move. In a way, you're disrespecting people's basic property rights. But utilitarians don't view rights as primary. They view consequences. And so utilitarianism says the only thing that matters is not individual moral calculations, but the total. And so utilitarianism can say it's all right if we disregard some people's rights, like their property rights, if in the end we're promoting more good than bad consequences, say, for society as a whole. And this is the assumption that underlies the practice of eminent domain. Note, if the people in Malaysia figured that there are more good results than bad results produced by building the dam, whether they view it in economic terms or view it in terms of balancing out the happier, uplifted lifestyle of people who now have cheaper, more available electricity that enables them to use life-saving appliances, have electric heat, air conditioning, stuff like that, and also run factories, make jobs, people, you know, lift their standard of living. But if you balance out and you say, well, there's a lot more happiness produced in building the dam than unhappiness in the 10,000 displaced villagers who don't really want to leave their native lifestyle. And also for Bentham, the suffering of the animals in that rainforest should have a place in utilitarian calculations. But if you judge that there's more happiness and unhappiness produced, then you can justify displacing those native peoples for the, quote, greater good. So objections requires too much of us. Some people say that it's very hard to get it right. Anybody from the Boston area? I know we got people from outside Baltimore City. In Boston, they had this huge transportation public works project they called it the Big Dig. And I mean, they were building subway tunnels, bridges, I guess even roadways. And the thing took many years beyond what it was predicted, and the cost of it was several times what it was predicted. One of the problems was Boston is so close to the sea that the soil wasn't really hard enough to be soil you ought to be digging tunnels through and stuff. And even after they opened it, water seeped in and loosened some concrete above a bridge, and some poor driver had a big piece of concrete fall through their windshield and kill them. So what's the point of mentioning it? Sometimes it's very hard to predict what the consequences are. But to do moral reasoning in the present, you have to predict what the results of doing A as opposed to B are going to be in the future, right? And so this is often very hard to do. And again, we said it forces us to assess others' private mental states. That's very hard. All we can do is make educated guesses. We can compare various things. Suppose you hate your job. How do you compare more overtime at your job and the negativeness of that versus gaining the extra money to buy a widescreen TV? You know, hard to do that. You know, we still have 4 or 5 minutes. Again, it demands too much of us. I'm not going to go into this, but basically, I think he makes this point in that video that it certainly was in the video that I showed the day before you all left, where Peter Singer says if your number one moral obligation is to produce for all concerned the greatest happiness and lessen people's pain, then think about buying a widescreen TV versus using that money to donate it to a third world food aid or third world medical relief. Isn't there a good chance that you'll lessen more pain and suffering than the happiness that you would produce by enjoying that widescreen TV? So Peter Singer says, no, it's not a discretionary duty, but we all ought to feel obligated to give till it hurts. You know, for causes like third world food aid, developing nation food aid. So I'm not going to go into euthanasia, but utilitarians have often supported euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, arguing that it's more merciful than forcing somebody to exist for 4 or 5 months with the pain of late-stage cancer. But the downside, the slippery slope argument against that is, well, would people be subtly pressured to opt for that way out and save whoever was paying their medical costs, whether it's the state or insurance companies, a lot of money? You know, in other words, if you make it legal, active euthanasia, who's to say that people wouldn't be subtly pressured to take that? But this obviously would go against somebody's fundamental right to life. So people say utilitarianism in making some discretionary duties mandatory demands too much of us. Okay. Again, okay, for people who just came in, I said normally my practice is to try to get things back in a week, but it has not been a normal week. And again, I showed some folks some pictures of my totaled car, and I'm not going to go into more than one, and of the other person's totaled car. This accident, and I'm seeing a doctor today because I'm still having back issues and stuff with it, and it's not imaginary. So, you know, even though I'm standing in front of you, it doesn't. But so this has been just a very trying week. But I'm going to try to start getting papers back to you on Wednesday, and hopefully get the rest of them back by Friday. So, okay, track down the roll. We'll continue. I may finish up, and I may start some review next time. I just want to see. Yeah.
I got 2 questions. When is final, and when the last day of class?
Well, okay. Just a second.